All right. So one question I get a lot is, what is consulting? And I've answered that question on a previous video, and you can go check that out. But really, what I want to, answer in this video is really what are the different types of consulting companies? Because there really are multiple types. And prime example of this, where we see companies will come on campus and they'll speak on a career panel of some sort, and you'll have three different consulting companies sitting on a panel, and they can have a very reasonable conversation, and they're not at each other's throat because they're not competitors, right? You could have a large consulting company that does IT implementations sitting next to a company that does small, it's a smaller consulting company that does more advisory work. And then there'll be another consulting company that does more managerial consulting or operations. And I think one thing that I would stress is to understand every company is going to kind of call things the same thing different ways. So what I would strongly urge you to understand is kind of what are these three basic types of consulting as I would bucket them. But then as companies start to talk to you and they say, oh, we do, advisory, you might want to ask them, okay, what do you mean by advisory? Do you mean this? Do you mean this? Because a prime example, when I would work at Accenture, I remember talking to my friends who worked at IBM, they did the exact same thing. And yet when we talked about things, we were like, well, wait a minute, what do you mean by the blueprinting phase? And we're like, well, that's where we blueprint out the system. I'm like, do you mean the design phase? And they're like, well, yeah, we call it blueprinting. We call it design. So what one company calls management consulting, another company may call it human capital consulting, right? Because the humans are your capital and they're the manager. And, point being semantics. So if I were to break it down, one of the company, one type of consulting out there is advisory. And advisory is actually a term that I really didn't hear a lot or use a lot when I was in consulting. But it kind of would, be companies that would do things around strategy consulting. Common firms you see in this are, the Bain, McKinsey's, and BCG's. And I've even heard people refer to them as the big three. And I'm going to tell you right now, if you tell me, do I know what the big three or the big four or the big five is? I'll say, what are you talking about? Are you talking about the big, the big whatever in strategy, the big whatever in implementation, the big whatever in management consulting? What are we talking about here? Because, you can look at a Bain or a McKinsey, and they're a very well-known company in strategy. But, you call them the big whatever, but there are companies that are consulting companies like Accenture and IBM and Deloitte that are way, way bigger than some of these companies that we call the big three or the big four. So understand, what are these three areas? And let's break it down. Okay, so first with the first one would be kind of this advisory. And under that would fit, companies that do strategy consulting. You could also bucket security consulting, and some people call it forensic consulting or managerial consulting. I've always kind of seen it as strategy, management, and IT. But again, everything kind of changes as the market changes. But, the strategy consulting companies are coming in to solve problems that are really at the company level. So we're looking at like, hey, we're coming into Netflix, and Netflix is trying to figure out how do they abandon the DVD mail business without ticking off too many customers, and how do they move strategically into a streaming business, and how do they, divest themselves from DVD? That's a very strategic company-wide thing. That's not really managerial consulting. That's not really IT consulting. Although out of this strategy project may spawn need to bring in management consultants to figure out how you're going to split the company up people-wise. Or you might have to bring in some IT consultants to figure out how you're going to separate the website now that it's not going to be doing DVD and streaming. So strategy consulting, a lot of companies do this now. I would say that, and I'll come back to that in a second, but, three that come to mind are Bain, McKinsey, and BCG. They do shorter term projects. They're not going to be 3-year projects. They're probably going to be shorter term assessments where they're going to look at a company big issue. They're going to use their methodologies and frameworks to figure out what is the best approach to solve this big strategic problem. And then they're going to move on. You come to the next area, which is more, management consulting. this is where I see, companies coming in and they will be doing maybe a longer than a few week project, but what they're trying to assess is a human problem, right? So you've got people's job roles duplicated. How do we, create this new division? How do we make things more efficient? Where do we look for process inefficiencies? Things like that. Operational managerial things that really affect people, not just the company at the high level. And companies that did this, back in my day, and this is a while back, but Deloitte was a very big company that did this back in the early 2000s, and they still do. But what I noticed was that Deloitte was really prime at getting this kind of work, whereas the next phase of work, which is IT consulting, this is really the project lifecycle of software development lifecycle kind of stuff. So we would come in and we would gather requirements, design, build, test the software, and implement it and roll it out. And a lot of what Accenture did was, project management. So projects that were so large, things like an Obamacare, right? A company that large, 400,000 people worldwide will come in, but they won't do the project single-handedly. They'll probably work with contractors, other companies, and they will help coordinate the implementation of this project, because it usually takes multiple people to make these projects work. So one of my experiences is that I worked in the IT consulting world and implementation, systems implementation. We were doing a lot of projects where, a company would come in and they had done, like, for example, Deloitte had done this assessment of the people of this organization. They recommended that they would upgrade their inventory system from their old COBOL mainframe to an Oracle-based system. And then that company would bid that work out to Deloitte and everybody else, and Accenture, we would come in and we would win that work and we would take it. So now, obviously, I'm not trying to say who does better work here, but I'm going to explain what I mean. What I found was that there were companies that did a lot of IT implementation. There were companies that did managerial consulting. So you'll hear of PwCs, KPMGs, EYs, companies that do a lot of accounting consulting and things like that will also do a lot of the managerial or the advisory work as well. PwC does a lot of security consulting, right? So, and then you have the strategy. Now, what's happening here is there's been a vertical integration that's been going on more and more. When I was at Accenture, most people we hired were systems implementation people, but we started seeing an increase in management consulting. And the reason why is that nobody wants to continue to lose work to a management consulting company when they potentially could do it themselves. So what's happening is that these system implementation companies, these tech consulting companies, big and small, started getting into hiring more managerial people to win the management consulting work. Because if you could win that management consulting work, then you could probably just convince the client to keep you on for the IT implementation that would potentially follow. So we're even seeing that vertical integration go the other way. We're seeing companies like McKinsey that do this very expensive strategy work. They also do system implementation now. It's very, very expensive, but they also realize they're leaving money on the table by only doing the strategy work and then handing that off to a management consulting company. They say, hey, we'll do the management consulting work too and the IT implementation. So essentially what's happening here is that consulting companies are now getting into where IT management and strategy, right? They're doing all three. And not all consulting companies. Some will focus on one industry like oil and gas, or they'll focus on one specific thing like management and IT, but not strategy. Or you might have UX UI consulting. But the point being is that when a consulting company comes on campus or when they're recruiting you, understand that there are different kinds. These strategic projects are typically smaller, short-term projects, not smaller, but shorter term. The system implementation, as you get further down to this side of the gambit, these are very long projects. They tend to be, although we are moving into a more agile world, they still tend to be a longer project. So that kind of hopefully lays out the different types of consulting. If there's any further questions, put it in the comment box below and I'll try to answer it. All right, thanks.